Welcome to week 2 of the Missional Life. In week 1, we looked at seeing people as Jesus sees them. Tonight, we're going to look at seeing ourselves as missionaries, people that God has placed in this world in order to join Him on a mission to connect with human beings. Now, before we go any further, home church leaders, I want you to actually pause this video and go over the homework that people had from this past week. People need to share whether or not they actually did the assignment and posted it to Facebook like they should have, or if there were problems posting or problems doing it. Spend a few moments talking about the issues, how we did, what we need to do differently. Pause and do that before you continue right now. So tonight, as we look at seeing ourselves as missionaries, I have as a passage John chapter 20, verse 21, where Jesus says, "As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." The word apostle in Greek literally means one who is sent out, a sent out one. Technically, in our culture, we would call that a missionary, one who is sent out. We're apostles with a lowercase a, in that we have spent time with Jesus so that we can be sent out by Jesus in order to invite other people to know Him. I want you to see yourselves tonight as missionaries. Number 1 actually should be filled out this way. We are missionaries, not evangelists. I've taken a lot of courses on evangelism, as I shared last week, and I realized early on, I'm not an evangelist. I know people that wherever they go, all they do is share the gospel. They share their faith with complete strangers on the bus, in the parking lot, on an airplane, walking down the street. Everyone they meet, they're always sharing their faith. And people are always responding and giving their lives to Jesus. I'm inspired by evangelists, but I'm not an evangelist. Now, I was a church planner 20 years ago at the Oasis, and when I started the Oasis, I shared my faith a lot. I had to survive. And I did see a lot of people come to know Jesus. But I realized that for me, it's not natural to do evangelism, but it's natural to love people. So you and I are not necessarily evangelists, but we are missionaries. And I want you to see yourselves that way. If you think about a missionary, there are both positive and negative views of missionaries. Maybe you like Billy Graham. Maybe you don't like televangelists. But whether you have a positive or a negative view of evangelists, it's not natural to who you are. But being a missionary, I want you to understand tonight, is natural. It's part of being a Jesus follower, is helping others come to know Jesus. I learned how both natural and unnatural this could be early on at the Oasis. When Hope and I first moved here, we got to know Jim and Shannon Ward and Bobby and Brandy Sodders in the first year that we lived here. And we eventually shared our faith with them, and they came to know Jesus, and they were all baptized on the same Sunday night. Shortly after they were baptized, Hope and I actually said to them, "Hey, we want to spend some time with you guys doing something really fun. Let's all hang out together." And they said, "What would you like to do?" And we said, "Look, we're not from Tucson. You're from Tucson. You figure out what we should do, and we'll do it." So those two couples got together and they hatched a plan and they told us about it and they said, "We've got the evening covered, follow us." We all got in the car and we drove to a place at the time called Pinky's, which was basically a billiards bar. So we get out of the car in the parking lot and we get in line and some guy is looking at people's ID on the way in. So I think Jim says to me, "Hey David, make sure you have your ID ready." And I said, "My ID?" And I realized at that moment, I've never been anywhere where I've been carded in my life. I'm a church planner. I'm 28 years old. I've never been carded because I don't go to bars. So I had my license and I walked in, and as soon as I walked in, I was just overwhelmed with cigarette smoke. Just the whole place was covered with cigarette smoke. So that was a lot for me to handle. And then I walk in and I see that people aren't necessarily dressed in ways that good, godly people dress. And then everybody's drinking. Everybody's drinking. Nobody is not drinking. In fact, Bobby said, "Hey, they have dollar beers here, so I'll get you a beer, Dave. What kind of beer do you want?" Well, at that point, I'd never had a beer. So I said, hey, I'll just take a glass of wine. And they looked at me like I had a third head, and they said, what? You want what? And I said, I'm just kidding. I'm just playing. You know what? I'm fine. I don't need a beer right now. And I didn't get a beer. But they drank. And everybody in the whole place is gambling. There's money on every pool table. And I realized every chief sin but one in the Baptist world was being committed. And then I noticed there was a dance floor in the other room. Of course, the girls go to the dance floor and the guys are left to gamble and to play pool. When I eventually went to the bathroom, I noticed that the entire bathroom was wallpapered in Playboy, which makes it very difficult to love Jesus and go to the bathroom. The reality is, it was a really uncomfortable experience for Hope and me. And that night we unpacked it and said, what'd you think about tonight? We both agreed that it was one of the most uncomfortable experiences of our lives. But we also realized that Jim and Shannon and Bobby and Brandy had done nothing wrong. They'd just gone out for an evening of fun. They didn't get drunk. They didn't get plastered. They didn't do anything evil. They were just having fun. And I realized right then that if I was going to be a missionary to these people, I had to love them where they were and point them to Jesus, not my way of doing things. That's what missionaries do. Missionaries have to be careful that they don't impose their culture on the people they're trying to reach, but instead invite them to follow Jesus in their own context. That's our goal, and that's what we're talking about tonight. Number 2 says that we live in a postmodern, post-Christian culture with a negative view of Christians. Here's what we mean by that. First, postmodern. Postmodern means we don't live in modernism, okay? In a modern culture, the main way people determine what they believe is reason. If you can prove it to me intellectually, I'll believe you. In a postmodern culture, knowledge is objective, it is certain, and it is good. And whatever it is, every culture accepts it as reality. Gravity is gravity, both in Italy and in the U.S. That's not the world we live in anymore. We live in a world that's often called postmodern, which means the way we think and determine what is right and wrong, the way we determine truth, is based no longer on reason, but on 2 things: personal experience and intuition. In other words, we live in a culture that believes what they believe because it feels right. They believe what they believe because their own experience says it's true. Also, knowledge is no longer objective, it's subjective. What's true on one planet is not true on another planet. Knowledge isn't certain, it's iffy. We're not really sure what's true and what's not true. We just have a good idea. And it's not always good. Knowledge can actually be evil or used for evil. So we live in a different world. We live in a world where truth and morality are determined by the community or subculture that people live in. That's the world we live in today. And we're also a post-Christian culture. What that means is, at one time, Christianity was in. It was trendy. It was popular. But that's no longer true. Christianity was on the rise at one point in our culture, and it has since tapered off, and it is less popular. People are moving beyond our Christian faith. We need to realize that. We need to realize the world we live in is not the world our parents or great-grandparents, and certainly not the first Americans lived in. We live in a different culture, in a different world. Christianity is not the majority faith, and it is not well accepted by other people. Years ago, I had a student come to me, and she said, "You're a Christian, right, Mr. Gainey?" And I said, "Yes, I am." She said, "But you're not one of those hardcore Christians, are you?" And I said, "What's a hardcore Christian?" She says, the kind that they, impose their beliefs on everybody else and beat people up with a Bible. And I said, "No, I don't like that kind of Christian very much. I try not to be that kind of Christian." And she said, "Good, good." Well, the reality is, by her definition, she could easily say that I'm that kind of Christian, because I do believe the Bible. I do believe in right and wrong. But I don't impose it on other people. I don't expect non-believers to act like believers. I recognize that my value system is mine, and I hold myself accountable, and the people in my spiritual community accountable. That's you. But people outside of our community, we don't expect them to live like they belong to the community of faith. So we have 2 standards, one for believers and one for non-believers. We don't impose our views on other people. Number 3, therefore we recognize we are the minority, and we embrace it. Folks, it's time for us, those of us in America who love Jesus, to realize we are no longer a majority faith. We're in the minority. There are more people that belong to other faiths or no faith at all than people who actually practice the Christian faith on a regular basis. We're in the minority. So you know what? Embrace it. The early Christians were in the minority. The earliest Christians were not popular. They weren't well received. They weren't well liked. Sometimes they were actually killed. But they were intriguing because they practiced their faith loyally, and they were authentic, and they were kind. Embrace Christianity the same way early Christians did, where they didn't expect all of the Roman Empire to bow down to God. They simply loved Jesus and invited other people along on the journey. If that's true, then our job's to build relationships with non-believers, to love on missing persons, but ultimately not to try to radically force culture to embrace our values. What I mean by that is, I've had Christians in my classes in the past get all worked up because Lowe's or Home Depot refers to Christmas trees as holiday trees. Oh no, holiday trees. They can't be called holiday trees. And they want to write letters, and they want to boycott, and they want to protest because they want the holiday trees to be called Christmas trees again, because that's what they are. Well, let's say that we were successful in persuading Home Depot and Lowe's to change the phrase holiday tree to Christmas tree. What's the victory? No one's going to come to know Jesus. In fact, just the opposite. What they'll know is we're just one more special interest group that bullies other people into using our language. That's not winning hearts. A lot of Christians are concerned about having the Ten Commandments on public display in courthouses and in other government buildings. I don't think this is a battle we need to care too much about. And I'm not trying to be political. I'm trying to say this. If we pour all of our energy in trying to get Christians to acknowledge, or non-Christians to acknowledge the Ten Commandments are the Ten Commandments, it doesn't change anything. Even if every single courthouse and government building in the country displayed the Ten Commandments, it would not persuade a single non-believer to bow their knee to Jesus and say, Jesus is Lord of my life. All it will do is teach people that we are bullies. And when we roar, they better listen or pay a price. That's not going to accomplish what we want. What we need to do is just love people where they are. And if society is transformed, you'll see more than 10 commandments in courthouses. You'll see people live out the 10 commandments. We need to see people transformed in their hearts. The issue is not to impose things on people externally. The point as a missionary is to convince people, to persuade people to fall in love with Jesus. That's the objective, and we need to keep that central. Now, number 4 says, therefore we must be the good news before we share the good news. In other words, evangelism isn't simply a matter of sharing information with people. It is information, but it's more than information. Someone once attributed a popular saying to St. Francis of Assisi. I don't know if he ever said it, probably not, but I love it. It says, share the gospel at all times, and when necessary, use words. Now, I think you have to use words to do evangelism. But the point is, there's more to evangelism than telling people the facts about Jesus. Real evangelism is loving people. Real evangelism is done in a context. When God tried to reveal himself to us, how did he do it? He became one of us. He became a human being. That we call that in the Christian tradition the incarnation. God became a human being to communicate himself to us. The way that you communicate God's love to your friends and family is you actually become the good news. You become the image of God in their lives. We have to work at loving people where they are. Missionaries have to love Jesus and others so deeply that it changes our character. Years ago, one of the highest compliments ever paid to me was paid without my knowledge at first. One of the crew interns was actually going around campus, and she was starting spiritual conversations like she's supposed to, with different students. And she comes across one young lady that actually attended one of my classes, and she is a practitioner of Wicca, a neo-paganism, and not a believer at all, not drawn to Christianity, but we had great conversations in class. So when this intern started talking to her, she says, "Oh yeah, I know a little bit about Christianity. I've actually been taking a religion class this semester, and we've had some great conversations." The intern said, "Who's the teacher?" And the young lady said, "Mr. Gainey." And the intern said, "Oh, I know him really well." And here's what the young lady said who practiced Wicca. She said, "Mr. Gainey is the first Christian I've ever met who's real and really loves people. He's the only Christian I've ever met that I like." I want that to be said of me more often. I'd like it to be said in my face. But I'd like to have other people say that a lot more often, that he is a real Christian. He really believes this stuff. He really loves people. That's my goal. That's my longing. Because I'm not going to draw people by my persuasive skills. I'm not going to transform the world by printing books. Ultimately, if I'm going to see a life changed in front of me, it's going to be because I'm real, authentic, and I really love people well. Number 5, therefore we have to speak the language of our culture. All missionaries know this. If you want to communicate the good news to a group of people, you have to go to language school first. The problem with Christians in North America is we assume we know the language and we don't go to language school. I really wish we'd go to language school. Let me tell you what I mean. We don't realize sometimes that we have our own jargon. Christianity has become a subculture in North America, and there's language that we use on the inside that no one on the outside uses. Purge that jargon from your vocabulary. I'll be honest with you, as a church planner, I made it my ambition early on at the Oasis to stop using language that non-Christians don't understand. So any word that Christians use that non-Christians don't, find another way to say it that makes sense to a missing person. What that also requires is that you really learn what the word means. In my classes at Pima, I used to ask the question, what does that word mean? Sometimes to a Christian who was using Christianese. And they would often look at me and go, "I don't know how to define it." And then I would say, "I wonder, do you really understand it?" If you can say it in a different way, then you really understand it. So avoid all religious jargon and learn to say the same thing in ordinary language. So stop saying save. We say save way too much. I choose not to use the word. Instead, I always say rescue. Non-Christians use the word rescue. Lost. As I've said already, don't use the word lost. Say missing. Sin. Sin is something we understand in our culture, but we misunderstand sin. We actually find that non-believers, their view of sin is not the same as ours. I don't refer to non-Christians as sinners so much as rebels. Rebellion is clearer to most people. Blessed. I do not use blessed. Never use blessed. I prefer to say honored or gifted. Use some word that a non-believer would use. Trust me, non-believers don't say blessed. Born again. Don't say born again. It's in one story Jesus told one time. It shouldn't become jargon. Instead, use a word like transformed. Changed my life. Use the kind of phrase that a non-believer would understand. Secondly, become familiar with pop culture. If you really want to understand the language of our culture, you need to realize that pop culture is the language of our culture. Everybody's getting pop culture. They're getting it on their tablet, they're getting it on their phone, on their television, on their laptop. Everywhere we go, we're getting pop culture. Pop culture includes music, it includes movies, it includes television, sporting events. We are saturated with pop culture. If you want to communicate to people in a language they understand, you're going to have to be open to some forms of pop culture. For most of us, this isn't a problem, but I know that some Christians have walled themselves off from the world and they want no pop culture in their lives. They want to be pure. Well, that's fine if you're going to die this week. But if you want to make an impact in this world for Jesus, you're going to have to be open to learning about pop culture. Learn to tell stories. Everyone loves stories. Our culture, though it's technologically driven, isn't much different from that of St. Patrick's generation. When St. Patrick went to Ireland to win over the Celts, he realized that because they were illiterate, the only way he could share the good news with them was to tell stories. They couldn't read the Bible, but he could tell them the stories of the Bible. Our culture is the same way. We're only slightly more literate, honestly, than the Celts. But we watch television, that's stories. We watch movies, that's stories. We read books, stories. Learn to tell stories. One of the most interesting classes I ever had at Pima in religion and pop culture was when I would teach the class on heaven and the afterlife. And we would spend time listening to music and talking about movies that discuss the afterlife. And then often I would ask the students, what would be the most awesome heaven to you? What do you think heaven is like, or what do you wish it would be like? And we would go around and people would share different ideas. And then sometimes they would say, Mr. Gainey, what do you think? What do you think heaven is like? And I said, well, I know what I'd like heaven to be like. And if I can imagine it's like this, it's got to be better, even better than this. And they said, what's that? And I said, well, I love Lord of the Rings. And I would love it if heaven is like being on my own planet. And I'm given a planet, and I'm in charge of that planet, and I'm like a wizard. I'm like Gandalf the Grey. And my job is to communicate God's love in some way to this culture and help them do really good things like destroy an evil ring and engage in adventures that matter. And life and death is on the line. And we're on a journey to do something really awesome. And the odds are small that we'll be successful. But if we are, it would change the world. That's what I hope. And I would tell a story like that, and students would be like, wow, that's more awesome than what I was thinking. And I realized stories are so powerful because when people watch movies like that, they're enraptured because it touches their deepest longings for knowing that their life matters. Learn to tell stories. Your story, God's story, Bible stories, other people's stories. Just learn to tell stories. Number 6. Therefore, we need to go, if we're missionaries, to them rather than expecting them to come to us. Look, missionaries know that they have no right to expect people to come to them. Missionaries go where the people already are. Christians in North America don't think they need to go anymore. They think, hey, we've got a church service, we've got a sign, we've got cards, people can just come to us. But most non-believers would never come to us. If we want to see most people's lives changed, we're going to have to go to them relationally first. It reminds me of a book called The Shaping of Things to Come. And in that book, the authors tell the story of 2 bars, one in Australia and one in Great Britain. The bar in England, there were 2 bars, and the bar in England was bought by a church. And it had been a bar, and the church in England bought it because they couldn't find any other place to meet. So they bought the bar and they transformed it into a church, reopened it a week later. Now it's not a bar, it's a church. The local newspaper did some interviews, and they had one elderly guy who had been going to the bar for years say, I'm so sad. This bar was a place where I was known. It's where I hung out every week. I had friends there, and I feel like I've lost a close friend. So what happened is the Christians came in and said, this is not a bar anymore. This is our space. In Australia, a church also bought a bar. But these Christians were missional Christians, and they wanted to reach the community. So they didn't even close it down. All they did was they hired followers of Jesus to be bartenders. And the people who were coming to the bar before they bought it were still coming the next week. And all they did was serve beer and tell people their story and ask people spiritual questions and spark spiritual conversations. And over time, a few of them came to faith. And when they did, they started a church in the bar on Sunday mornings before the bar opened. That's missional. Christians are supposed to go to the world rather than expect the world to come to them. Number 7, therefore, be yourself. Just be you. God made you unique. And He gave you the personality that He gave you. He gave you the story that He gave you. You are who you are because there is a way that you bear God's image that no one else does. So just be yourself. And if you are yourself, if you offer your heart, people are going to be drawn to you in a way they're drawn to no one else. So just be yourself. I recognized years ago that the way I was going to lead people to Jesus was to just be me. And I went through the 6 styles of evangelism that I'm going to show you in just a moment. When I went through that, it said that I was the intellectual style of evangelism. And I thought, okay, well, if that's true, if my way of sharing my faith is using reason and my intellect, how can I maximize that for the kingdom? After meditating on that for a full week, I came to 2 conclusions. Number 1, we should do the Alpha course. If the intellectual style is my style, then the best way for our church to reach non-believers is for me to actually teach Christianity as a course. The second conclusion I came to after a week was I need to get a job teaching in a community college, because that's where I can be salt and light and see non-believers come to know Jesus. So I did just that. So turn the page and we're going to briefly look at the 6 styles of evangelism. The first style is the direct style, which is a lot like the Apostle Peter in Acts chapter 2. People with this style are more direct, bold, assertive. They skip small talk. They get right to the point. They have strong opinions and convictions. This is the kind of person that never meets a stranger. They sit down on an airplane next to someone and they have shared their life story before the plane lands 45 minutes later in Phoenix. The second style is the intellectual style, or I prefer to call this the academic style. This would be the Apostle Paul in Acts chapter 17. These people are analytical, logical, they're inquisitive, they love to debate, and they're more concerned with how people think than how they feel most of the time. These people really want to use apologetics to persuade people about the faith. The testimonial style is like the blind man in John chapter 9. They're good communicators, they're even better listeners. They're vulnerable about their personal life. They're overwhelmed by how God reached them, and they see links between their experience and the experience of the person that they're talking to. On the next page, you'll see the other 3. The interpersonal style is like Levi or Matthew the Apostle. He had a party where he brought all of his new Christian friends to meet all of his old pagan friends. They're relationally warm, they're conversational, compassionate, friendship-oriented, and they focus on people and their needs. The 5th style is the invitational style, and that's the woman at the well in John chapter 4. People with this style are very hospitable. They're persuasive. They enjoy meeting new people. They're enthusiastic, optimistic. They never go anywhere alone. They pack the vehicle and take people with them. And then there's the serving style, which is Tabitha in Acts 9. People like this are very patient and other-centered. They see needs and enjoy meeting them. They show love through actions more than through words. These people are the ones who serve people behind the scenes, and that often opens up doors to share the gospel with people who won't accept a front door approach. So why don't we go over the 6 styles of evangelism? Because we want you to understand that there's a natural way for you to communicate your faith. We don't want you to try to be somebody else. We want you to just share in the way that fits you. Intellectual style, if that fits you, do that. Whatever fits you, you do you. In the words of millennials everywhere. You do you. Be yourself. Be yourself. All right. Number 8. Realize that God can defend himself. Christians sometimes argue with non-believers about stuff, in fact, sometimes stuff that doesn't even matter. And it never works. Whenever I've argued with someone, I haven't converted them to seeing things my way. I just get them on the defensive, and they become more and more entrenched in their own views. So don't argue with people. Ask questions. Say, that's interesting. Why do you feel that way? Ask questions, express your point of view, but never argue. You don't need to defend God. God can defend himself. The metaphor I heard once from a pastor was, you don't defend a lion, you just open the door of the cage. The lion can defend himself. God doesn't need you and me to defend him. Just share your faith and leave the results to God. Number 9, if you're going to be a good missionary, you're going to have to get on their side. You're going to have to get on the same side as the person you're trying to reach. You're not their adversary. It's not us versus them. You are on their side. You're on their side of the chasm. Years ago, I had a mom, an older woman, middle-aged, take one of my classes. And she took my class, and she shared early on that she was a Buddhist. Several weeks into the semester, we're waiting outside the room to go into class, and we couldn't go in because the other class was still meeting, and I started having a conversation with this woman. And I asked her if she grew up in a Buddhist home, and she said, no, actually, I grew up in a Christian home, and my mom is very upset that I've chosen to become a Buddhist. I said, really? She's upset? And she goes, oh, my whole family's upset. They all think I'm going to hell. I said, why'd you choose Buddhism? She goes, different reasons. And then she basically said, I have an aunt that to this day is a fundamentalist. And that particular aunt is always dogging on me because of my faith. I said, so your aunt is not very Christian? And she goes, I guess not. But I'm always nice to her because my mom recently passed away, and I know she would want me to be kind to my aunt. I said, you know what? It sounds like you're a better Christian than your aunt. She said, but I'm not a Christian. My aunt is. I said, I know. And the irony is, you are more like Jesus to your aunt than she is to you. I just wanted to blow her mind. I just wanted her to see for a moment that Jesus is more like her and less like her aunt. And that you can reject your aunt without rejecting Jesus. Jesus is a separate subject from her overbearing aunt. So get on their side and leave all the heavy lifting to the Holy Spirit. Number 10, don't hide your faith. Be open about spiritual matters early. Now, I rarely share very much early on in a friendship, unless the other person asks. But I make sure I let them know where I'm coming from early on, so that when we do talk about spiritual matters later, Jesus isn't a complete surprise. So I make sure they know I'm a Christian early on, even if I hold back on having really long, deep conversations about Jesus. I find Christians fall off on two sides of the boat. One side is they're always talking about Christianity, they can't change the subject, and they're overbearing. The other kind of Christian is the secret Christian, and they never come out of the closet, and nobody knows they're a Christian ever. And then when they finally mention they're Christian, people look at them with surprise and go, really? You're a Christian? Romans 10, verses 14 and 15 says, how then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. So we have to share at some point. Bring it up early. Earlier today, Dustin and I were at a coffee shop, and one of our members was in the coffee shop. And we're just having a regular conversation about donuts. And then all of a sudden, as we're getting ready to leave, the gal says, Dustin, I want to come to your home church. And he said, oh, do you have the information? Do I need to write that down? He writes it down and gives it to her. It only took a few seconds, but she said that in front of at least 4 different employees. All 4 of them just heard her talking to us about home church. Now, it's not a surprise if she eventually talks about going to church, because they all heard it. She's not trying to be an undercover Christian. She's not trying to keep it a secret. Don't keep it a secret, because the longer you do, the harder it will be to talk about spiritual matters later. Number 11. Be open to start spiritual conversations. I don't do a lot of traditional evangelism in that I rarely sit down and tell people the whole story of the good news at one sitting. But I do have a lot of spiritual conversations with people. Some are very significant and some are minor. But what I have learned to master is how to transition a conversation to a conversation about spiritual matters, which may or may not include Jesus. So how do you do that? Well, let me give you 3 practical ways to initiate a spiritual conversation. Number 1, look for bridges. There's all kind of bridges that can lead to spiritual conversations. One would be movies. Movies are a great bridge because so many movies out there cover important concepts. One of the most important concepts I learned about teaching religion and pop culture is the idea of the Christ figure. A Christ figure is anybody in a movie that does 3 things. Number 1, they come from the outside. Just like Jesus is God become man. Number 2, a Christ figure or a messianic figure always suffers. They may not always die, but they always suffer. And number 3, a Christ figure in the movies always rescues other people somehow through their suffering, just like Jesus did. So there are lots of Christ figures. Every superhero movie is really a Christ figure. One of the most popular Christ figures in movies today is Harry Potter. Harry Potter is an ideal Christ figure. You can use the concept of the Christ figure to have conversations with people about your Christian faith. Look at movies as a bridge. Music can be a bridge. Books, holidays. So many holidays actually have a religious background. So look at every opportunity you can to build a bridge. Secondly, ask questions. Ask really good questions that get people thinking. And it's amazing how many questions ultimately lend themselves to spiritual conversations. Take a genuine interest in other people by asking questions like this. If you could change one thing about your life, what would it be? If you could change one thing about the world, what would it be? What's the most significant thing that has ever happened to you? What do you long for most? Just ask really awesome questions and sit back and listen. And before you know it, a spiritual conversation will begin. Number 3, use the invitational style of evangelism, whether or not that's your style or not, to invite people to Alpha, to Beta, to home church, to the Sunday gathering, especially Christmas Eve and Easter services. Find ways to invite people to places where other people will communicate the good news. A good start is just to invite people to a Matthew party that your home church is having. Let me give you a few other thoughts in closing. Take risks. If you're going to be a missionary, sooner or later you're going to have to jump off a cliff and have a conversation that is going to be weird. Number 2, as much as possible, talk one-on-one with people rather than in groups. You always make more progress when someone is not exposed to other people where there's sometimes shame. Number 3, don't give monologues. As James chapter 1 verse 19 says, be quick to listen and slow to speak. Listen more than you talk. The best missionaries are good listeners. And lastly, make the most of split-second opportunities. There will be a moment where you'll realize I could go in one of two directions, make light of this moment, or go where Jesus is inviting me. Pick that second option. I remember years ago being on a summer mission with Campus Outreach, and I was in Panama City Beach, Florida, picking up trash on the side of the road, driving a truck and stopping and picking up trash and driving a truck. I was in the car with a guy I had never met before. He was brand new. It was his first day on the job, an older black gentleman, 20 years my senior, sitting next to me. His name was John. We were driving down the road, and then it started to rain. We pulled over, and I said, maybe it'll stop raining in 10 to 15 minutes, then we can keep picking up trash. So we're just waiting and talking to each other. So I decided to try to start a spiritual conversation, but I wasn't very sharp at the time. I wasn't very subtle either. So I sat there in the car, the truck, and I thought about it. And I finally said, wow, you see that lightning bolt? And John said, yeah. I said, I bet if that hits you, you die. Real subtle attempt at switching to spiritual matters. John looked at me and he said, I'm afraid to die. I said, why are you afraid to die? He said, because I would go straight to hell. I said, why do you think you would go straight to hell? He says, because I killed a man. It got real quiet in the truck for a second. And I said, what do you mean you killed a man? When did you kill a man? He goes, about 20 years ago. I killed a man. Well, I was close to your age. And I just got out of prison. And because I killed a man, I know I'll never be forgiven. In that split-second opportunity, I had the option to talk to him about King David, who killed a man, about Moses, who killed a man, and how God forgave both of them. And we had a conversation that led to more conversations. And by the end of that summer, I was able to lead John to Jesus. But I took the opportunity to follow the path right in front of me. And I took a risk. Don't miss those split-second opportunities. When I get asked a question these days by someone, I feel like I've just won the lottery. Man, I love asking questions. When I ask a question like, what's the most important thing that happened to you? I love it when one girl said, what's the most important thing that ever happened to you? I said, I'm glad you asked that question. I felt like I've won the lottery when they asked me that question. So, let me just close by saying that God made you unique, and He placed people in your life on purpose. He also placed you in this home church on purpose. You are a missionary. Don't ever forget it. And now for your homework assignment and your end of session activity. So last week, your homework was to come up with the names of 3 people that you would have liked to invite to Easter Sunday. The real question is, who's your 3? We want everybody at the Oasis to come up with 3 people that they can invite. We know that if everyone invites 3 people, a certain percentage of those will say yes. If 1/3 say yes, then almost everybody gets to bring someone with them. If only 1 out of 6 says yes, then every other person at the Oasis brings someone with them. So you've identified 3 people you'd like to invite to join you on Easter Sunday, April 12th at the Oasis. Now here's what I want you to do this week. Here's your homework assignment. Pray for those 3 people. That's it. Just pray for them. Pray that God will move in their hearts to say yes. Pray for yourself. Pray that you'll have the courage and the boldness to ask them and to say it in a way that's not, just completely awkward. So pray for you and pray for those 3 people. Take time to do that. And then again, if you have some kind of Facebook group as a home church or some kind of online thread, share that with the rest of the group. Home church leaders, make sure you follow up with every single person this week and ask them if they have prayed for their 3 friends. Hold them accountable to do that. Now, your closing activity today is a lot like last week. If you'll go back and look at your impact list you developed at the end of the first session last week, if you'll go back and look at the names at the bottom, get in pairs and pray for those people. That should include the people you're going to pray for later this week as homework. And pray for all of those friends, that Jesus would draw them to himself, that he would put strategic people in their lives, that he would make them aware of their need for him, and pray that he will somehow use you to make an impact in their lives. That's the activity for right now.